He listened, so one was really traumatized by that service. History always talks about people who fight and sacrifice for their country. They narrate the events of important people who wiped out a battalion or who freed an entire village. All of this is very well known, but it's rare that we know about those who in the midst of the fight or war were attacked and suffered at the same time. Today, I come to introduce you to Ingrid Alderrock, a woman who led the security service of Augusto Pinochet. This case is about how dozens of people were captured and subjected to extreme suffering like electric chairs, beatings, threats with firearms, and abuses using animals. This last one was one of the most famous, created by the evil mind of Ingrid. She had her faithful friend Peruno, whom she had trained to take advantage of the victims. It was for this reason that she would be remembered by hundreds of Chileans as the woman of the dogs. It's a pretty bizarre case, quite eerie. Ingrid Felicitas Alderrock Bernard was born in March of '44 into a German family. Her father had to move to Chile at the age of 29 because the Germans had lost the war, and out of pride he didn't want to show his face in defeat. He was always a very strict and proper man. He never tried to get along with the neighbors or his co-workers, as he thought they were of a very indecisive race. He met his wife in the early 30s, they got married, and quickly had children. He took charge of educating them at home because he didn't let other people get close to them or learn Spanish. Needless to say, he was a proud German man from these World War II groups. I won't tell you the names so we don't get censored, who wanted to implant in the heads of his successors that this was right and they should be proud. Ingrid was the one who obeyed her father the most, while her siblings, Hannelore and Karen, did not agree much with their father's racist thoughts. From a young age, she was very active in certain sports. She loved to play tennis, ride horses, ice skate, climb mountains, and even was a blue belt in judo. The family had a good income, so they never struggled to give their children everything they asked for. These hobbies were taught by their parents, as they in no way wanted the Chileans to approach the little ones. They could never make a friend or get to know the country on their own, because the father thought that one day they would return to their nation, and it was not worth getting attached to Chile. As soon as the children came of age, they left home to stop being under the regime, which was their father's regime, and his thoughts, well, his silly thoughts. But Ingrid was different. She did believe in everything her tutor had taught her throughout her life. Before she turned 15, her progenitor lost his life, leaving her and her mother completely alone. She fell into a deep depression, as the most important man in her life had lost his life, and she didn't know how to handle her feelings, so she was always in jail, filled with anger and rage. Her brothers, on the other hand, returned home to show respect and mourn him, but they couldn't bury him in Germany as he had wanted. But they did organize a funeral very much in the style of that country of Germany. Several months after this unfortunate event, Ingrid found out that part of the inheritance had to be divided among her brothers. She didn't like this idea very much because they weren't present in his last days. This event was a turning point, as until then Ingrid didn't know what she was capable of. Until that moment, where, consumed by resentment, she devised a malicious plan to make her sister suffer. She had been spying on her for months. She watched her go out with her friends and had to learn her work departure schedules. She started practicing Spanish in order to make friends who could help her with her crazy idea. The group that Ingrid hung out with were men who were only with her to get, well, pleasure, you know? She promised them these favors, intimate favors, in exchange for them obeying her orders. One afternoon, while Karen, Ingrid's sister, was coming back from her job, she was beaten in the street until she fell unconscious. They put her in a car, and when she woke up, she found herself tied to a chair. Upon seeing her sister, she wanted to ask for help, but she only responded with a strong blow to the face and several taunts. The young woman was very distraught. She didn't know what was happening, or why her own blood wasn't helping her. Ingrid had to explain to her the reasons why she had kidnapped her. She told her that she had always held a great resentment towards her. She didn't know why her father had left her an inheritance if she was never as good as she was. He then kept her captive for several days without food and without permission to go to the bathroom. All the time, the men abused her in front of her sister. They beat her like a punching bag until she lost consciousness. Karen begged him to please let her go, that she was going to move to a place where he would never see her again. So Ingrid agreed to this only on the condition that she would also give up the inheritance, and if she reported him to the police, things could get much, much worse for her. By this point, Ingrid had experienced the power of caution, of causing fear in people, of causing terror. She liked this about infringing, as I tell you, fear, so that the victims moved like puppets to her orders. And here is where she began to investigate militarized schools in order to exploit her potential. But there were hardly any women. Luckily, in the year 67, the Carabineros authorized the admission of women to the officers' school, and she quickly enrolled in the first course. Having experience with judo and other martial arts, it was very easy for her to integrate and increasingly be in the sights of important people. She was the first parachutist in Chile and Latin America. She honed part of her experience in shooting, and one of her peculiar talents was training dogs. All of this made Colonel Manuel Contreras, leader of a secret service called Ladina, set his sights on her and summoned her to join part of this association. She, for her part, agreed to join, and when she integrated, it seemed like she was born to be in that place. This service was created by Augusto Pinochet to be able to overthrow Salvador Allende. What they did was steal people, make them suffer, and take the life of anyone who was against Pinochet. Ingrid, as the months went by, was promoted for the macabre and soulless way she was on each mission. She was there when there was a coup d'etat and Villa Grimaldi was raided for the first time and forcibly taken from its owner to build the Terranova barracks, one of the most important centers of suffering, torture, and disappearance during Pinochet's dictatorship. She was also involved in Operation Condor, which involved persecuting leftist opponents. It is said that this was one of the most aggressive persecutions, as its victims were more than 1 million people, over 50,000 people from all over Latin America. These events were a real terror, and in fact the files that were found on this subject were named as Archives of Terror. Likewise, she was a member of the Purin Brigade, named the only woman to belong to such a high rank. After obtaining this position, she knew she was going to be able to contribute ideas to make extremely sinister people suffer. In the one she was in a place very close to the city, there was a woman who was very boring. On Aran Street 3037 in the municipality of Macul, this in Santiago de Chile, they created a kidnapping house that would later be known as Venda Sexy, or the disco. This is where Pinochet's opponents were transferred and were beaten, electrified, and even psychologically and emotionally abused. It is estimated that more than 80 people passed through these doors, and less than half came out alive. This house was 2 stories and had a basement. Each floor was dedicated to a type of suffering, and men were separated from women. The victims spent most of the time blindfolded and completely naked. People, not being able to see anything, were subjected to mind games. They were made to believe that there were shooting nights, but they only shot into the air each time they abused something. They took advantage of someone, either a man or a woman. They played music at full volume so that they could not hear their own screams. They hung them from an arm for days or weeks. They forced women to give birth and then watch how they eliminated their babies. They gave men electric shocks in their private parts and almost never fed them. Ingrid, in her free time, offered to open a school and help more young people in school, To train to face Pinochet's enemies, she taught them to fight, to always maintain a cold posture and have logical thoughts. Most of the women were kidnapped and forced to belong to the army. If they opposed, they were sent to the barracks of suffering, and the weak ones were, well, they quickly took their lives. Ingrid had a German shepherd dog named Bolodia. This dog was always by the woman's side and accompanied her to the enemies bathed everywhere to protect her from any attempt of attacks against her. Sometimes she let it loose to chase the victims, and they didn't know where to run because they were blindfolded. One night, while everyone was asleep, Ingrid was devising a new way to cause suffering, and when she turned to look at her canine, she knew she would take the suffering to a much higher level. Being very good at training dogs, it only took her 2 weeks to train several animals so that they could abuse the people locked up. One of the first victims was Alejandra Holzappel, who survived and narrated how it was the first time they implemented this method of suffering. They put everyone around the person the canine was going to. Taking advantage, they forced them to watch the terrifying scene and listen to the screams of pain from the poor girl. They had them threatened. If anyone dared to turn around or close their eyes, they would be next. At night, the cries could be heard again, and the fearful listeners could only imagine that they could be the first or the next. Sorry. Several testimonies stated that the other officers would put people in the place of the victims. The woman, seeing the terror she was sowing, the screams of desperation, and the vomit of disgust felt by her victims, decided that this form of suffering would be her personal signature. Every time someone tried to escape, they were sent directly to her, so she could bring out her German Shepherd and proceed to commit such an atrocious act. People were becoming more and more fearful, preferring to lose their lives rather than encounter Bolodia and her owner. After this, the women banded together for protection. They realized several factors that would either set them free or not make them suffer as often. One of them was that when they were on their period, they were not abused, so they would take a small cloth and fill it with blood from a bullet wound of a fellow woman and put it on their clothes. When they were taken to the room of terror, one of the victims who went through the abuse of the animals was Marta Nera Munoz, who had been a Chilean secretary and a militant of the leftist movement. She was arrested along with her partner Cesar Arturo. The woman lost her life after being subjected several times to abuses by men and dogs. She was one of the young women who rebelled the most against Ingrid and her companions. She attempted to flee from the woman's house but failed. The woman bid her farewell multiple times, yet she ultimately succumbed within the confines of the sensual blindfold. Although there were not numerous deaths in the nightclub as in other areas where there were also barracks of suffering, it is said that their methods were much more violent and atrocious because they placed a lot of emphasis on the humiliations of abuse. There was no inequality and everyone suffered because it was under the control of Ingrid. She never had mercy. There were children and teenagers who were not older than 15 years, but she treated and made them suffer like adults, just as her father had done. Being in charge reminded her of her father every day. She believed that perhaps he was proud of her for fighting for the country that saw her grow up, just as he fought for Germany. There were days when she was tired due to her age, and on other occasions she did not go to the barracks. Her face showed noticeable suffering. Realized what had happened. The woman always had 3 guns close at hand. One in her purse, the second on the nightstand, and the third in the kitchen oven, because there was a rumor that there was an organization against Ladina with ex-agents. Many began to fear because the enemy group was growing larger. So in July of '81, she left home to go to the barracks. But suddenly, several vans passed by in a caravan and began shooting at her. Luckily, she only received 2 shots, one in the head and another in the arm. She was quickly taken to the nearby hospital. One of the bullets was very close to the brain, so the doctors said there was nothing more they could do for the woman. The woman stayed in jail and was taken to a hospital that could no longer help her. Several of the officers threatened all the medical staff to save her, so they just told them that to keep this woman alive, they had to leave the bullet in her head. She was then sent home. She survived the 2 bullets, but the aftermath prevented her from continuing to go to the barracks and do things that required a lot of effort. The entire country heard about this event and considered it a kind of miracle. One of the most important magazines in Chile wrote the following: "Surely because of her enlightened personality and her Christian faith, she has been endowed with a spiritual and physical vitality that has allowed her to overcome the serious injuries inflicted weeks ago by a ruthless criminal in the service of atheistic and bloodthirsty communism." They also added that he was an exemplary officer, and that's why he deserved the second chance that life gave him. As the months and then the years went by, the woman became increasingly frustrated. He had spent a large part of his life causing suffering to people, from his sister to the innocent women of Sexy Sale. Hearing people cry and inflicting fear was a routine for her. But all this ended since the time of the attack, as her colleagues also did not want her to risk being attacked by another person. She began to think that perhaps the assault she had was planned by one of the secret services because of her attempt to desert. She felt ashamed of herself because she felt she was dishonoring her father and her nation. At times, she thought she deserved to have the bullet in her head as, let's say, a reminder of how weak she was for wanting to quit her job. She lived many more years after almost dying from the gunshots. She was recognized as one of the best agents of Pinochet's dictatorship. Even several people said they noticed a big difference after her retirement. There was no longer so much fear. The dictator's empire was slowly falling with this. There were fewer and fewer victims in the barracks because they were escaping more easily. The school where Ingrid trained young people was declining, and people who were no longer afraid to testify against this monster began to come out. In fact, a woman named Nancy Guzman began to delve into the files of the Pinochet government, and on several occasions came across the name of Ingrid Alderrock. Thanks to the witnesses and what was in the document, the woman was summoned to testify about what was happening in the sexy blindfold. She only told the story of the bullet in her head and said that she had lost her memory. Thanks to this, she went unpunished and was quickly released. Everyone knew what Ingrid had done. The entire country was demanding justice, but the judge and authorities couldn't do anything. So Nancy made the decision to write a book about this woman and tell her story, also taking into account the statements of the witnesses and survivors. He would occasionally go to visit Ingrid. He interviewed her with fear because her mere presence terrified him. Every time he asked her something about the sexy blindfold or her role in Pinochet's army, she claimed to have never known him or the house he mentioned. Even with lost memory, she remained a cold and sinister woman. Sometimes she insulted the interviewer and proudly claimed to be from this German group, which I told you at the beginning that I couldn't mention, that she was from this group by birth. She also confessed that she hated pacifists, and every time she had the chance, she would pull out her weapons to intimidate the interviewer. She was also asked about her ability to train dogs, but she only said that she had won professional awards and that she would never mistreat an animal in that way. In her book, she also talks about the sufferings narrated from the perspective of the survivors. One of them begged her not to publish her book where her confession was included until her mother passed away because it was too strong, and she didn't want her to read her testimony. Nancy kept her word, and by the year 96, she published her book called The Woman of the Dogs. Ingrid died in 2001. In 2001, she died of an acute digestive hemorrhage while resting at her home completely alone. She went down in history as one of the women who terrified an entire country and yet went unpunished. If you liked this video, don't forget to follow me on my social networks, and see you tomorrow in a new video. For the counts, then they took several turns and stopped about 5 or 4 times. They stopped, and then we arrived at a police station and I thought the counts were there. Then they hit them. They had them on the wall, and then a lieutenant said, "Do you know that we are criminals?" He asked, "Do you know your future? We are going to kill you." He said, "We are going to take you to a barricade, and we are going to kill you there. We are going to declare you dead, and then we are going to say that the same people killed you. So people are going to be against their own kind.